Have you ever been walking through a graveyard and wondered what stories could be hiding, which fascinating historical figures may be there? Some of these gravestones tell whole stories, writing out the details of a life lived. Others are simple, and sometimes there are no stones at all. There is a perception that only white British loyalists were the ones to settle eastern Ontario, but that's not the case. In 1779, the Crown offered protection to black people who deserted the American rebels and their rebel owners. Approximately 10% of the loyalists who immigrated to Canada were black, but the majority of those who came to Upper Canada were still slaves, owned by their military masters who they fought beside in the war. And here in Brockville, it was no different. Some of the first people to settle in Brockville were black slaves. Unfortunately, there are few records of these people, and what records we do have are a combination of very basic information and information provided by white historians and historical figures. One such record is a bill of sale found in the early 1900s for the Grenville County slave sale held on August 30th, 1788 in Augusta. At the sale, Daniel Jones Jr. sold an 8-year-old slave girl named Elizabeth for 25 pounds to his brother Solomon Jones. Years later, in 1795, we also have an account of 3 men who were going and searching for runaway slaves. When they found those slaves, they refused to return home. One of the earliest accounts of a black slave in Brockville was a man called Caesar Congo, who came with his master, Captain Justice Sherwood, and his family. On the family's way to Brockville from Montreal, he was tasked with helping 2 young boys when the boats had to be towed over rapids, either by carrying them on his back or by guiding them over rough terrain. Sometime after arriving in Brockville, Caesar Congo was sold to a Sherwood relative, Captain Bottom, who lived somewhere near Prescott. After 20 years, Mr. Bottom freed Caesar, and we know that he married a free black woman and settled somewhere in Brockville. We know he lived on Return Street, which was later renamed Congo Street and is now known as Kincaid Street. To support his family, Caesar Congo worked in a tavern owned by Charles Jones that stood somewhere on the corner of King and Market Street. And from there, really, his records in Brockville seemed to disappear. In the Leeds and Grenville area, in the late 1700s, to the abolishment of slavery in British North America in 1834, there was slavery. In fact, in this area, there were more enslaved people of color than there were freed. Another one of the few black stories that were recorded in early Brockville history is that of Richard Underwood. In 1832, Thomas Underwood, a West Indian merchant, moved from Antigua to Brockville with his whole household, including a 14-year-old African boy called Richard. According to the newspapers, Thomas and his family weren't very well liked. They treated everyone in Brockville with rather an upper hand. But this was also the same year that Brockville was going through a huge cholera epidemic. And it affected rich and poor, old and young, and unfortunately Thomas Underwood was one of these victims, who, as the newspaper reported on October 4th, 1832, passed away from cholera. After Thomas's death, his family moved away, leaving young Richard stranded here in Brockville. Richard ended up staying and making a life for himself and took his master's surname Underwood. He found work as a laborer and married Jane, an Irish immigrant, and the couple lived in a small framed house near the CNR station. At 70 years old, Richard died of heart disease on March 11, 1886. After his death, Jane requested that he be buried with his former master, right here in Thomas's grave. Well, for whatever reason this request happened, it was granted, and this is Richard's final resting place. There should be 2 other stones to accompany this one for Thomas Underwood. One dedicated to Richard Underwood, who died in 1886, and also one for his wife, who died in 1893. When walking around tombstones in the old Brockville cemeteries, it's hard not to wonder about the lives and the stories of the names written here. However, the gravestones that are not present are just as important as the ones that are, and they tell their own compelling history. Thank you for joining us from Stories from the Stones, and I hope to see you next time.